Hi everyone, this is Jonathan from College Greenlight. Thank you for joining. We're going to start this webinar in about 5 minutes, so hold on.
Hi everyone, this is Cassandra. Just wanted to let you know we'll be starting in 2 to 3 minutes, so thanks for joining early, and we'll get started shortly. Okay everyone, there's a couple more people that are starting to log on right now, so we'll start in about 1 minute.
Thanks everybody.
Okay, hello everyone. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon for this webinar on supporting rural students through the college admissions process. My name is Cassandra Stark. I'm Partner Relations Specialist here at College Greenlight.
And I'm Jonathan April, the General Manager of College Greenlight.
We're honored to be joined by Andrew Moe of Swarthmore and Megan Taylor of the University of Michigan today, who will be presenting the heart of this webinar. We're excited to have so many of you on the line. Today's audience is a unique mix of high school counselors, CBO advisors, and admissions professionals from colleges across the country. Over the past weeks and months, the topic of supporting rural students has received significant attention, and on this webinar, we'll address how rural students fit into the national conversation about access, the unique challenges and assets that rural students have in the college search and application process, challenges colleges have in recruiting rural students, best practices for addressing these sets of challenges as well. So at any time, please type in any questions you have in the chat box, and we'll address as many as we can at the end of Andrew and Megan's presentation. Now, for many of you on the line, this is your first introduction to College Greenlight, so we wanted to give you a quick overview and why this topic is close to our hearts. So established in 2012, College Greenlight has worked diligently to become the leading college and scholarship platform specifically focused on first-generation, low-income, and underrepresented students. We connect the important stakeholders serving those students, like counselors from schools and community-based organizations, scholarship providers who provide important funding to students, and colleges. We seek to address important college access issues like undermatching, affordability, counselor capacity, college recruitment of high-achieving low-income students, and closing the information gap. More than 1,400 schools and organizations, such as college access organizations, high schools, and upward bound programs, use our free platform to help students research and connect with colleges and find scholarships. Our tools allow organizations to track and measure student progress.
More than 175 top colleges, including nearly 60% of the nation's top 100 schools, rely on College Greenlight as an important recruitment resource, using our technology to connect directly with students that meet their recruitment objectives and build recruitment pipelines with the schools and organizations that support them. As a virtual platform, College Greenlight reaches organizations and students in all parts of the country, from Chicago and New York to Little Rock to Moscow, Idaho. We support students and counselors in all areas of the country, so we think deeply about how best to support students in small towns and rural communities, hence the idea for this webinar.
If you're a counselor and are interested in learning more about using Greenlight with your students, or if you're a college interested in recruiting more students, please type "I'm interested" in the chat box, and we'll follow up with you after. And now we're going to pass it over to Andrew and Megan so they can introduce themselves.
Wonderful, thank you so much. My name is Dr. Andrew Moe, and I am an Associate Dean and Director of Access at Swarthmore College. Director of Access essentially means that I get to have the time and space and resources to think about rural and small town students among many other populations, such as first generation, low income, and undocumented students. Just very briefly, I grew up in sort of an independent small city of about 50,000 people in southern Wisconsin, so not super small, but really not connected to a metropolitan area. I didn't have access to college fairs or high school visits or recruitment events. And even in high school, I had to drive about an hour and a half to Milwaukee to meet with a college representative when I was conducting my search. Many of my high school classmates, though, were farmers, and so I certainly understand that perspective, and I also identify as a first generation and low income student going to college, and we certainly know that many intersecting identities exist for rural students. We don't want to conflate those populations, but certainly many of our rural and small town students will share some of those identities as well. So thanks so much for having me.
And hello, my name is Megan Taylor. I'm a research fellow in the Office of Academic Innovation at the University of Michigan, and my research primarily focuses on the relationship between rural communities and higher education, and more so on the transition that students experience as they prepare for and transition into higher education, whether that be at a community college or a four-year institution. And similar to Andrew, I grew up in a pretty rural area in northern Michigan. I'm from Holton Lake, Michigan, which is about 3.5 or 4 hours north from Ann Arbor, where the University of Michigan is. And that personal experience helped to prompt my interest in my professional and research experiences. And I'm also a master's student in the School of Education in the higher education program here at the University of Michigan. So I'll hand it back over to Andrew to share more about the national context.
Great, thank you. So before we begin to talk about really some of the challenges and assets of rural students and their communities, we wanted to make sure everyone on today's webinar is aware of some of the national conversation around college access and some of the research around rural students. So we'll start with the size. According to the US Census, about 59 million people and nearly 10 million students live in rural areas, or about 20% of the population. And that's in addition to another 29 million people living in small towns. So the population is not negligible. This is a sizable population for anyone who cares about improving society and improving kind of the economic needs of society. Further, a full third of all public schools and about half of all operating school districts in the United States are located in rural areas. And nearly half of all students in a rural location receive free or subsidized school lunches, with very large shares in both the South and the West. And so that sort of contributes to the heart of what I was talking about earlier in terms of intersecting identities. So is every rural student a low-income student? Absolutely not. Is every low-income student located in a rural area? No, but we certainly see some intersecting identities here. And compared to their urban and suburban peers, rural students attend college at a lower rate. In fact, just 29% of 18 to 24-year-olds are enrolled in post-secondary education, compared to about 48% of urban students. So despite the sheer size of the population, relatively few colleges, especially selective schools, consider rural students as a population deserving recognition in diversity mission statements. When college admissions officers are getting together, we often talk about multicultural recruitment. We talk about first-generation low-income recruitment, but rarely am I in a setting where there is immense knowledge contributed towards rural and small-town recruitment. I should say, though, that there are notable exceptions. Regional comprehensive public institutions and community colleges really do a great job at recruiting rural students. And so I am speaking from a very particular institutional perspective of being at a selective small liberal arts college. And finally, the reality is that we have a changing economy. Projections conclude that in a few short years, nearly 2/3 of all jobs will require some post-secondary education or training, and more than 1/3 will require a bachelor's degree or more. To put that into perspective, in 1973, 72% of jobs required a high school diploma or less, and now just 36% require a high school diploma or less. And I'll turn it over to Megan.
Great, thank you, Jonathan. And I'm excited to be here today to talk about the unique challenges and strengths that rural students and communities may experience. So I'm going to begin by sharing an overview of common challenges or themes that students may experience as they're preparing for higher education. So the first being the effects of distance and isolation that often structure these communities. The second being strained or lack of resources. And then the third, challenging characteristics that may influence or shape students of the rural community. And so I will speak to each of these individually, but first just wanted to kind of provide that broader overview. So the first one being the effects of distance and isolation. At the top here, I've highlighted one quote from a counselor who shared with me that nearly every challenge of rurality relates to distance. So it comes back to the geography, because that makes things more expensive and it makes things take more time. And so this can be manifested in a number of ways, one of which is difficulty visiting college campuses for students who may have transportation barriers or just simply driving those hours to visit campuses. So one of the research projects I'll share with you today, I surveyed about 350 junior and senior students at 3 different schools in northern Michigan. And when I asked them if they had visited a college campus before, 76% of them responded that they had, but only 61% had visited a 4-year institution, and only 36% had visited more than one college. And when I asked them where or what colleges they had visited, we again saw a really large influence by location. And so students were significantly more likely to visit colleges that were within an hour or 2-hour range, as opposed to Michigan State University or the University of Michigan, which were about 3.5 or 4 hours away from their communities. And on the flip side, we also know it can be challenging for college admissions or recruiters to visit schools due to the distance they need to travel and smaller class sizes, which can be difficult if there are less students in that school who may be interested in their institution. And then finally, for rural students, often their experiences can remain largely within those that the school can provide. So one counselor explained it this way, that when you are in a more urban or metropolitan area, you have more access to things like public libraries, bookstores. You see people out and about in their professional lives, and there's more exposure in a number of areas that are limited in rural communities. So one good example is limited exposure to professional careers. I always joke that when I was in high school, I had no idea what engineering was. I really don't think I understood it until I was maybe a sophomore in college. And so because of this exposure, it kind of shapes how students come to think of higher education. And collectively, this can lead to higher education being seen as risky, unknown, and even unnecessary. And so this is why it's so important for us as practitioners to really build strong pathways that are built on partnerships between K-12 and institutes of higher education, and that are really grounded in practical best practices and college knowledge that students can use. So secondly, I'll highlight the theme of strained or lack of resources. So first, lack of funding, which of course is not limited to only rural communities and rural schools, but there are a few unique ways in which funding may interact with rurality. So one example is that rural communities may often have smaller or less wealthy local tax bases available to support rural schools. And then secondly, rural districts often have to spend a higher proportion of funding on their buses and transportation in order to cover their more kind of vast geographic districts. And so one counselor shared with me that the funding available for schools barely allows them to meet the state accountability measures, let alone extra funding for post-secondary preparation efforts. And secondly, outdated or limited technology and limited access to internet or broadband. So this is, again, not limited to rural schools, but something to be aware of. Maybe students may not have access to internet once they leave the school, or may be limited in terms of what data or where broadband is available. And then thirdly, there can be a difficulty to provide a diverse or rigorous curriculum. And this is for a number of reasons, one being smaller staff sizes or teacher shortages, which can lead to larger class sizes and leads for less kind of free space for electives or advanced classes. And so because of this, often rural schools need to tailor their course offerings to what students are interested in. And so if only a few students are interested in a specific advanced placement course, they won't be able to offer it unless there's enough students who would enroll in the course to kind of balance that out. And we see this also in foreign language courses and in students' opportunities to dual enroll. When often a community college may be up to 40 minutes or an hour away, it can be really difficult for rural students to either travel there to dual enroll in classes or take a class online, in which case it may not transfer over to 4-year institutions. And so it does make dual enrollment challenging as well. And then finally, I just want to highlight the challenges that can come from lack of a fully staffed counseling office. And so I'm sure, as many of you know, our school counselors have a vast range of responsibilities that may range from coordinating course schedules to monitoring student audits for graduation and more. And so what we know is that their time is in really high demand, and it can be challenging for them to also have time to fit in post-secondary planning to the degree that they would like to. And so one quote I just want to highlight up here from a counselor, she shared with me that she could easily do the career and college advising piece as a full-time job, and that she wishes she could, but that she only does maybe half of what she'd really like to do, and that it's a dream to do more. And so this just really highlights that even though this counselor had the heart and the desire to engage more in this space for her students, she was really limited by capacity within the school and within her position. So just another thing to be aware of. And then the third theme I want to highlight is influences of the rural community that can shape students. So rural communities may have lower rates of educational attainment, which is the percentage of community members who hold an associate's or bachelor's degree. And so, for example, in the communities that I've partnered with, this has typically ranged from 13 to 20% of community members. And this can lead to overall pursuing higher education not being normalized within community culture. And then secondly, we know that there can be an increased rate of socioeconomic disadvantage in rural communities. So as Andrew noted, the number of students who qualify for free and reduced lunch, and this really relates back to that reality of intersecting identities that rural students may have. And so this could lead to a higher proportion of first-generation students who may not have that built-in support and knowledge in their homes or in their communities that can support them as they're navigating the college application and preparation process. And they may not have that same types of social capital that continuing generation students may have within their homes. Similarly, because of the different types of rural labor economies that may be, there could be a lack of professional models or mentors available for students to really encourage them throughout this process. And so collectively, this can lead to a lack of a college-going culture, which is when students are actively encouraged and supported as they are planning for their post-secondary education. And it can also lead to a lack of collective college knowledge in the community, or knowing what they should be doing to be preparing and what they should be doing throughout high school. So collectively, this can create a large gap or gulf between students and higher education. And one counselor referred to this as the chasm. So when we talk, she shared that when we talk about college readiness, there can be a really large gap, and that she feels that she sort of launches students into this chasm, and she hopes that higher education catches them. And this quote has just stuck with me since she shared it with me 2 years ago, because I think it's so powerful to think about the pipeline and pathway that our students are experiencing as they're transitioning into higher education. And again, this is not exclusive to only rural students or rural communities, but they do interact with this in a unique way because of the physical distance and gaps that they might feel and that less exposure that they may have to higher education. So with this in mind, I just want to highlight that what we've learned from teachers and school counselors is that rurality structures student exposure to higher education. It does not structure their aspirations or the value that they have of higher education. So some previous research on rural communities, primarily in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, known as rural migration theories, often kind of theorized that rural students might have lower college aspirations because of the nature of their communities. And this type of literature is really starting to fade away now, and we're coming to understand that rural students have really strong and powerful aspirations, but their communities are structuring the way that they're exposed to the college knowledge and the capital that they need to be able to authentically pursue their aspirations. So I want to briefly show a few data points that demonstrate this. The first is student aspirations. So when I asked students what their plan was for after graduating high school, an overwhelming 73% of them indicated that they plan to pursue either a 2-year or a 4-year degree. And so even though I thought this was really incredible, it was really puzzling to me because I knew that this was really had a big discrepancy between their plans and then the enrollment patterns of their high school. So in comparison to that, the partner schools I was working with, their class of 2015, on average, the number of their students who attended a 2- or 4-year institution ranged from 24 to 37%. And so we're talking about a gap here of upwards of 20% of students who said in February of their junior or senior year that they planned to go to college and then didn't enroll in the fall. And so the first question was kind of, why is there this large gap? And then secondly, looking at students' value of higher education or valuation, when I asked students how important it was to them to continue their education after high school, we again see upwards of 78% of students indicating that it was very or extremely important to them. So I just highlight this to show you that just like other students, rural students have high values and aspirations for college, and they see it as relevant and helpful for their life goals and as something important that they want to pursue. But this really demonstrates the difference between having aspirations and the ability to really pursue your aspirations. And so one teacher phrased this as, our lower-income students knew that they should say they wanted to go to college, but it was a completely abstract thing. And there was not reality to the statement or a deeper understanding of what it might take to get there. And so this just really demonstrates how we need to help build in that college knowledge. That way students' aspirations can be really grounded in that as they move forward. And now as I just move to concluding, I want to show a broader overview of what I've just talked about. And so this concept map here can kind of demonstrate this process. So as I shared, rural communities can limit students' exposure or shape the way that they're exposed to higher education. And then resultantly, they may have a lack of college knowledge or essential knowledge they need to be able to pursue college. And I suggest that this leads to what I call a mismatch between their expectations, their goals, their aspirations, and reality, or what they need to be doing as early as 9th grade to be prepared and beginning to transition into higher education. And so this can lead to low enrollment and attainment rates for rural students, and then challenging transitions for those who do enroll in higher education. So just kind of wanted to share this broad overview as we lead into best practices. And I also want to briefly take a moment to highlight the abundant strengths of rural students and rural communities. So what we know about rural students and their communities is that they grow up in really strong, tight-knit communities of individuals who really care about the students and the school. And so I phrase this as the ability to be known. One school counselor emphasized that when a student comes to her, she knows all of their prior knowledge. She knows where they come from, their family, their goals, and she uses that to personalize how she advises and interacts with them. And so there is a great unique power in being known that way by your teachers, your school counselors, your principals. And we also know that these schools are often the lifeblood or the center of these rural communities, and that the community really invests in its school and its youth. So it's very common to see community members or organizations like the Rotary or Kiwanis or local faith-based organizations be really actively involved in the school, which can just be a really powerful support for students. And then finally, we know that students are resourceful, they're persistent, and they're trailblazers. So trailblazers are the words we use that our first-generation students on Michigan's campus identify with. And I think it's a really great word to use here as well to showcase the strengths of rural students. So in concluding, I just want to highlight that it's so important that we are recognizing both the challenges and the strengths of rural communities, and that when we're partnering with rural communities, we're really seeking to leverage those strengths and really leaning into an asset-based approach and not using a deficit approach that's been used historically, but really thinking about how can I connect with rural students through their lens and through their values and their experiences, and then connect with them on that way. And I also just want to highlight again that expectations and aspirations are not enough to drive enrollment or attainment or to really guarantee that a student has the resources and knowledge that they might need to pursue their aspirations. And so really focusing our efforts on helping to build those supports and pipelines in for students. And with that, I will transfer back over to Andrew to start sharing a little bit more from the college perspective, and then we'll lead into best practices.
Thanks, Megan. I just want to emphasize the fact that, I believe in an asset orientation as well. So we will be talking about challenges, but you'll notice that the challenges in recruiting rural students really have nothing to do with the students. It's all about the challenges that we face as admissions offices and colleges. And so several challenges do exist on the college side in recruiting students, but none of these things that I'm going to mention today are insurmountable. And we're going to share some strategies to counter some of these specific challenges. So first, barriers created by time and distance. And what I mean by that is essentially the recruitment phase, right? So admissions officers only have so much time during the year to dedicate to recruitment and outreach efforts. Typically, this is 3 to 8 weeks or so in the fall, perhaps a few weeks in the spring, maybe in April and May, and sporadically during the summer. And that's, again, using the selective admissions type lens and the office from which I come. In an urban center like New Orleans or Philadelphia, an admissions officer could potentially visit 6 to 7 schools and a college fair or a community-based organization in just one day. And that admissions officer might be seeing dozens, potentially hundreds of students at high resource schools where college counselors know the institution well and social networks recognize really the value of this particular institution. In a rural area, it's very different. And so it might be upwards of 45 minutes between visits. Sometimes that means 3 visits in a day is really the maximum number of schools that are a possibility to visit. And even more remote areas, so if you think about the mountain states, I was just in New Mexico, you might be talking about an hour to an hour and a half between school visits. So time and distance can certainly be a challenge. Recruitment strategy really relies on previous visits and existing relationships and where we have prospective students. So it's this idea of go where you know. It is unfortunate, I will say, but this practice it's certainly practiced at many types of institutions and admissions offices. We rely on previous visit histories, existing relationships with counselors, where we might have current students coming from, and of course names and information purchased by the College Board and the ACT organization. I will say rural recruitment, just like under-resourced school recruitment, is hard work and sometimes with an unknown payoff. But I really believe that we have a responsibility to train our staff to do this work and do it well. The third barrier or challenge is this idea of critical mass in rural areas versus urban areas and some of the infrastructure that exists in more urban areas. So at a rural school, I might have just one prospective student in my database. Unless an admissions officer is really willing to put in more work to talk more broadly about college access and financial aid, which I highly recommend that they do, officers will skip rural schools with fewer students. And that's an unfortunate reality that really needs to change. Community-based organizations are helpful in that they draw students from multiple schools, but relatively few CBOs exist in rural areas. Upward Bound is certainly a noteworthy exception to this, as well as some regional programs like the Ayers Foundation in Tennessee, Palouse Pathways in Idaho and Washington State, and a few others doing really fantastic work. And then the fourth challenge is the existence of social networks. And so there are very different social networks in high resource schools versus lower resource schools. So family, friends, parents, teachers, and counselors all influence students' perceptions on college choices. We often hear from our current students that counselors influence their choices in exploring. We hear from our students that their counselors said, what are you going to do with a liberal arts degree? Or I've never heard of Swarthmore. And this can often be challenging since students aren't regularly talking about the list of colleges they're considering and not often being prompted to think about the college search process by their existing network. And so that can certainly be a challenge. Before I move on though, you'll notice that I'm not including a lack of achievement as a barrier. Talented students live everywhere, and research shows this. Students in rural areas are graduating high school at a higher rate compared to their urban peers, and that's all the more reason for colleges to include rural students in their recruitment plans. Turning a little to more best practices to effectively recruit rural students in rural communities. Despite some of the challenges that exist, we can work together to counter some of these challenges with best practices. One is the use of technology. So I say this cautiously because it absolutely is not the only answer. Technology can be a great tool if it works. We know rural communities have varied degrees of access to broadband and updated computer systems, like Megan was talking about. When everything works well, things like web sessions, email targeting, online campus tours, Skype sessions may work really well, but we're not recommending this as sort of the Band-Aid for every problem or every challenge. I know at Swarthmore we're starting a visibility program called Small Towns at Swarthmore to bring these resources together and to deploy them strategically to students attending rural schools. So we're attempting to sort of scale this across the entire country. Second, empower your regional directors with data. This was a huge challenge for us in that if I told a recruiter in my office, please go visit some rural schools, I think the first thing that they would probably do is open up Google Maps. And that is a really unsophisticated way to think about rural recruitment. So we actually use National Center for Education Statistics data to pinpoint every single rural public and charter school in the country and identified those data points in our database and provided that to our regional directors so that they understand where rural communities exist, not simply by Googling it. Alumni Volunteer Recruiters Program, so many offices will employ their alumni to help out with interviews or college fairs. And there should be no exception in rural communities. Hawksby and Avery are researchers that did a lot of research around this, and they found tens of thousands of rural students who have the grades, have the standardized testing to get into a selective school, but they're not being tapped because they're not living in more metropolitan areas where they have access to recruiters. And so one way would be to talk with your alumni about doing coffee visits or maybe Skype visits if distance is a big issue, but pinpointing rural alumni and having them work with rural communities. Dedicating resources to rural populations. So what I recommend is probably starting in your own backyard with on-the-ground recruitment, right? I don't expect institutions to have a national campaign to look at every rural place out there. It's probably not feasible, but in your own backyard is certainly one place where you can start. Training your staff, whether that's recruitment training or reader training, so dedicated time to talk about this. I know that our retreat is next month, and we are actually holding an entire session on rural and small town recruitment and how to do that. Those of you that have fly-in opportunities, so sometimes these are student fly-in opportunities, sometimes you have counselor fly-ins, please include or at least consider including rural perspectives. We do so with our Discover Swarthmore program. It's more work, it's more resources, it requires some creativity and problem solving. So the person who books all of our travel will often come to me and say, this person is about 3 hours from the nearest major airport. Are we able to pay for mileage for the parent to drive that student to the airport? And our answer is a resounding yes. So you really have to think about that from a logistical standpoint as well. And then using application fee waivers strategically, making sure that some of those barriers are really broken down in the process, whether it's rural students, low income students, first generation students. There are definitely ways to do this. campus. And then finally, prepare for the visit. So when I schedule a session at a rural school, I don't typically simply just send a poster and hope for the best. I actually schedule a phone call with a counselor. Maybe it's a 10-minute phone call to say, these are the students that I'm looking for. Maybe it's a couple of bullet points so that that counselor can help me identify students that might be a good fit for my community. It takes more work, I promise, but it's going to be a better scenario than sitting there and not having anyone show up to your visit. Some additional best practices that we can point to: understanding student perspectives and responding appropriately. And so this is similar in some ways to under-resourced students, underserved students. Rural students may have varying beliefs, perspectives, experiences, and we really want you to meet them where they are. So when I go to a college fair and I'm talking with rural students, sometimes students will ask me about the size of campus, right? And what I really need to think to myself is, what are they interested in knowing? Are they interested in understanding, can we create smaller communities so that it mimics some of their high school classrooms? Are they worried about going to a really large school and attempting to try to figure that out, right? When they ask, are you private or public, I could very easily say we're private and leave it at that. But understanding that students might actually be asking about cost of attendance and have some belief structures around public schools being less expensive, private schools being more expensive, and we know that that's not always the case. And so I recommend to my recruiter colleagues to really think about those perspectives. Connecting with prospective students with current students who have those very similar identities. And that's part of our Small Towns at Swarthmore program, is that we want to make sure that current students are able to be identified and connect with prospective students. Being sensitive to counselor time and resources, this could include if you have an email program, an email that goes out to counselors, being very succinct, being very to the point, and realizing that counselors may only be able to spend 30 seconds to a minute reading that email instead of a really long email that might not be filled with information that they need to know. If you are inviting counselors to counselor breakfast, realize that they might not be able to attend if it's 45 minutes to an hour away. So again, being very sensitive to that. Avoiding jargon. So when we think about FAFSA, CSS profile, a registrar, a bursar's office, impacted majors, early decision, be very sensitive to explaining what those types of things mean, because you might be the first college admissions officer visit to that school for that school year. And so know that they might have additional questions that they might not want to ask you. And then finally, leveraging rural strengths. So this might be similar to international recruitment. When we start international recruitment, I recommend that you look at your current footprint. So do you have research programs in rural communities? Do you have alums coming from those communities or current students from there? And how do you really leverage those existing footprints to contribute more toward better recruitment in those areas? And with that, I will turn it back.
I also want to quickly circle back to one of the bullets here with connecting prospective students with current students and share an example of how you could empower your current students to be involved in the recruitment process. So one thing we did at Michigan this past academic year was a number of students from the UPER Club, or Club of Students from the Upper Peninsula, partnered with our Office of Enrollment Management, and they actually called the parents and students who are from rural communities who had been admitted and offered to, talk with them about questions, to meet with them if they came to campus, and really made themselves available to be a mentor and student for them to connect with, and it ended up having really powerful results on our campus as well. And so this is another example of kind of looking in your backyard and seeing, whose students are here on our campus and how can we invite them to be a part of this.
Absolutely. And I think Megan's going to take some of the best practices for counselors and practitioners as well.
Yeah, so moving into this viewpoint, a few that we had kind of brainstormed here was thinking about helping to expand students' social networks. So if you can think of connecting students with other alumni or professionals that you know who may be able to do an informational interview with the students or connect with the students' families or answer their questions. It's always a valuable way to kind of connect them to someone externally. Similarly, helping to explore external college advising options and resources, encouraging students to use things like Big Future or official SAT prep or other resources they might be able to use on their own time as they are available to. Really making an effort to engage with families and parents and from an earlier standpoint. So we know that parents and families are so influential to our students as they're preparing for college, and connecting them so that they feel empowered with the information they need to support their children and their students. And even if the parents may not be very familiar with higher education, one practice could be just reminding the parents that they know their students and their child more than probably anybody else, and they can support them in so many ways, whether it be, a care package or an encouraging note, or just reminding them of the own influence and positive power that they could have in encouraging their students. Reaching out to admissions officers if you want to learn more about a specific institution, or inviting them to your school to have those conversations and presentations. Looking for professional development opportunities to continue to expand your own knowledge and resource well that you can then use to support your students. And as we talked about throughout the webinar, really recognizing those intersecting identities. So again, as school counselors in rural communities, this is something that you have such a good strength in, and knowing these students fully and knowing their families and their backgrounds, but recognizing how those might affect their higher education as they're preparing and thinking about that. And then, of course, always advocating to the best of your ability. And lastly, sharing college knowledge early. So I know that often with time demands, it can be challenging to find time to connect with younger students. But if you have opportunities to connect with even 8th or 9th grade students, we know that at this time they're making, decisions that can affect their pathways and their options for post-secondary. So if you're able to meet with them to start thinking about their high school experiences and their high school courses, or to help dispel some common myths maybe about the affordability of college or the purpose and value of college, but really some of that basic, bare bones knowledge that they need as they're beginning to form their self-identities and their visions for their future can be really helpful. And then just a few more here on the next slide. Thinking intentionally about transportation or financial barriers that your students may have, and thinking about how you could connect with higher ed partners to solve some of that. So one example, Central Michigan University has actually had a really great experience with providing buses for students. So rather than the high school needing to use a bus, Central Michigan has been sending a bus to the students to pick them up, bring them to campus for a day. They've been providing lunch and then a ride back as well. And so many counselors have said that this has actually been the most accessible thing that a college or university has done for them as they've planned site visits. So thinking about that, being aware of potentially limited access to internet that students may have at home. And then I wanted to touch on engaging in activities that might help build your students' sense of self-efficacy, and that help them build a really tangible action-based plan that kind of help them move from beyond just their aspirations to having, confidence in knowing this is what I can be doing in 9th grade, this is what I can be doing in 10th grade, or this is what I can be doing over my summers, to really be engaging in behavior that will help prepare me for post-secondary education. And so activities that really help to empower students and build their self-confidence can be really powerful and influential for them. And then lastly, giving students resources and coaching for how to talk with their families or parents about college. This can be challenging for many first-generation students specifically, having that conversation about why I want to go or affording college, and giving your students some coaching or tips for how to have those conversations can be really helpful. So, Andrew, did you have anything you want to add before we transition into questions?
No, I don't think so. Thank you.
Great. So here we've listed our emails as well as our Twitter handles. And if you're interested in continuing the conversation with us, or if you have specific questions, we would love to hear from you. So please feel free to reach out to us if you're interested.
Okay, thank you so much, you guys. That was really, really informative. And we've also had a couple of questions come in, so if anybody on the line still has more questions, we'll take as many as we can for now. But to start off, we have a question that asks, how does the U.S. Census and/or the NCES define rural?
I can take that. So it's probably a longer conversation than a minute of answering the question. We had to work for about a year to really figure this out. It's not the same for each agency, and so the U.S. Census will think about these in terms of essentially population clusters and the proximity to sort of a major metropolitan area, whereas the National Center for Education Statistics will classify schools as city schools, town schools, rural schools. They work off of one another's methodology. But what was really nice is that you can actually go to the National Center for Education Statistics. You can download the entire data set. I think you have to do it state by state, to be honest with you, but you can download the entire data set and you can see every public high school in America and what their designation is. So it might be like rural fringe or rural remote or town remote. And I do have some slides. If you wanted to email me, I can actually show you the slides of how we did it. I did it for another presentation. And then we made some decisions on what is actually considered rural for our purposes. However, that also required us to go out and attach the SID code or ETS code to every single school. That's why it took about a year for us to do it. And so we had student workers and our assistants working on that because there's no national data set from the College Board or ACT or NCES that will give us that methodology.
And I also just want to add into Andrew's response. He noted the fringe, distant, and remote. So there's actually 3 categories that are used to define rural. So again, it speaks to the variance of rural communities, and that's something that's helpful to be aware of and how they can kind of grow depending on how remote they may be.
Okay, thank you so much, guys. The next question is actually to Greenlight. Someone asked if they can have a copy of this presentation, so we will email a copy of the presentation to everybody that registered for the webinar, so those will be coming in as emails sometime today.
And Megan, there was a question in one of your sections. You had mentioned that the lack of exposure and distance may frame higher education to be risky, unknown, unnecessary, and scary. Could you go into a little bit more detail about what that means?
Sure. So when students may not have so much built in, if it's not as normalized in their community about going to college, it can really seem like, I don't know anyone else who's done this. Or, for example, to pull on a personal example, when I was in high school, I was interested in the University of Michigan, but only one other student had gone to Michigan for my high school in the 5 years that I knew of. And she unfortunately ended up coming back to our community after her first year, right? And so that was really scary to me. Why are there no other students from my high school or that I know who have gone to Michigan? And when I came as a freshman, you know, there were people who had 30 or 40 people from their high school who were at Michigan. And so that kind of lack of a pathway can be kind of scary for students. It can make them kind of have some questions about, you know, why should I go to college, or what is it like to go to college? So really kind of leading into that information gap. And then also the unnecessary piece can come from, you know, if students aren't hearing information about how college can prepare them for their future careers, then they may not understand kind of the long-term benefits of going to college, especially like Andrew mentioned, the value of a liberal arts degree. So often, you know, parents might be asking, like, why do you want to study philosophy, or how are you going to get a job with that? And so that can be something that can be sort of intimidating for students who are, just trying to figure it out themselves. And so that's why I think the solution to this is just helping to really share as much accessible knowledge as we can from our institutions of higher education. That way students can really understand, what it's like for someone like them to go to college and what resources are available once they get there, what financial aid's available, and things like that.
Awesome. Okay, and then the next question mentions that something they have trouble with is getting rural students to say yes and leave home once admitted, even with high or full aid awards. Often this is due to lack of family support for them going away from home. Can either of you share any ideas to help with this?
Yeah, I can. I think Megan alluded to this earlier. Using your parent base is really important. I think using your current student base. So depending on what the barrier is, if it's really kind of convincing a parent that the student is able to go to college, can do the work, and can move to college, whether that's 40 miles away or across the country, I think connecting current students' parents who are coming from rural areas, again, it takes more time, it takes more resources to help identify those folks, but I think every college will have some kind of parent office where you can tap into some of those resources and say, would you be willing to talk with this family? They're having some reservations about sending the student to Swarthmore, to Central Michigan, wherever it might be, so that they can talk to their peers. The same can be said of students. But I think that it does take more time, and with tracking, we all know about summer melt and what that might mean. And so being very diligent about having those conversations with students and their parents, I think would help, at least from the college side.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. So the next question states that a U.S. News and World Report stated that as many as 1 in 3 students start but do not graduate. Do you know how this breaks down from rural to urban college-going students?
So I would share that rural students do have relatively lower numbers of persistence, very similar to urban students. And since I don't have the data in front of me, I couldn't say whether it's exactly more or less, but very similar experiences. And you can actually go into, like Andrew was pointing out earlier, the NCES database, where it can show you data for each specific high school and their enrollment rates all the way up until their graduation rates 4 or 5 years later. And I'll just share kind of broadly, since I don't have the statistics in front of me, though, that it is a pretty significantly lower persistence rates. And so this kind of relates to what Andrew was saying earlier about really connecting students with communities that can support them once they arrive to campus.
And I'll just
add,
I'll just add that, I'm not sure if there's definitive research to support this, but we do know that many of these metrics are actually based more on income than they are on rurality or ethnicity. And so typically a low-income student will graduate at a lower rate for various reasons. We could talk for the next hour about those specific reasons. I'm not sure if researchers have pointed to the rurality of that student as being a contributing factor of not graduating from college.
So the next question was about, is there a space where counselors and CBOs serving rural students can interact with admissions folks interested in students? And does College Greenlight have a space? And so I can take this from the Greenlight perspective. Our mission at College Greenlight is to connect the important stakeholders for students, including CBOs supporting students and colleges looking to recruit those students. From the college side and the CBO side, we have a directory of CBOs across the country that CBOs can utilize to promote themselves to colleges, and that colleges can utilize to search to find CBOs that are supporting students all across the country, including rural areas. So the CBO directory is definitely one great way to facilitate those connections. But also Greenlight, we're also sort of a 24/7 connector between those two. We talk to our CBOs all the time. We talk to colleges all the time. And through those discussions, we love to be able to connect both of those groups together. So if you are a college that wants to connect with more CBOs, or a CBO that wants to connect with more colleges, let us know. That's the mission of Greenlight.
And I'll mention two other resources. So one is going to be a Facebook group. It's called the College Admission Counselor Facebook group, and it's about 15,000 strong. So I do log in with my personal account. I don't know if you feel okay with doing that, but it is essentially a closed network of college admissions officers, high school counselors, and CBO advisors. So like parents, the media, students, they're not allowed to be admitted to that Facebook group. And it really is a nice way to share information in real time. And a lot of folks will pose questions that they're grappling with. So that's one resource. The second resource is a free resource called the Talent Ed Project, and you can just Google the Talent Ed Project. It is another sort of social network-ish platform where you can connect with college admissions officers that care about college access, and they certainly have a rural mission to it as well. So College Greenlight, Talent Ed, College Facebook Group, College Counseling Facebook Group are wonderful resources to connect with folks.
We're going to take one last question. We actually have a few more that maybe we can take offline, but we only have time. We're running out of the hour, so we'll take one last question.
Okay, and that question talks about summer melt. So it says summer melt has become a large topic of interest for higher education institutions regarding enrollment numbers and therefore affecting revenues, incoming class sizes, post-secondary attainment as well. So what practices have both the private and public markets used to best utilize low summer melt rates?
I can highlight two brief initiatives, and then maybe Andrew can go from his perspective at Swarthmore as well. One thing I know that we've been doing in Michigan, our college advisors who are a part of the National College Advising Corps have often been organizing events throughout the summer to kind of check in with students as they're preparing, packing, transitioning. So they've been kind of doing trainings to be prepared to support students maybe at a meeting in July, one meeting in August, and they found really positive results from hosting those types of events in their local communities. And then I also want to highlight Georgia State University is doing some really great work in this area. They created actually a digital chat box or chat bot. It's called Pounce, and it is designed to support students as they are, going through the enrollment process. And if you're interested, you should really learn more about what they've done. They've seen really, really significant results in reducing their summer melt, specifically for their underrepresented students. So I think that's the greatest example I could point you to. But Andrew, do you want to add?
I think those are great resources. I will say I do have a particular perspective from Swarthmore's perspective. We fortunately don't worry too much about this. I think that there is no silver bullet. There is no magic way to reduce summer melt. I think it really just takes a lot of strategies and a lot of understanding what are the barriers in our body, whether that's financial or social, that will prevent students from enrolling or staying with their enrollment decision. And so it's probably all hands on deck. It's resources from the Dean of Students Office and faculty advisors, and maybe you're inviting students to their own class of 2022 Facebook group so people are excited, but it's really probably just staying engaged. That's probably way too simplistic, realizing that there are lots of factors at play, but I imagine that there are additional resources online where we could point you to.
Okay, thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. We hope that you learned a lot. We know that we did on our end. So thank you also to Andrew and Megan. You guys provided a lot of invaluable information that I hope everybody takes with them. Again, everybody will be receiving a recording of the webinar, so keep an eye out for that. And we look forward to continuing the conversation with all of you in the future.
Thanks, everybody.
Great, thank you.